The gunshot echoed across the valley as Yancy Carter wiped the sweat from his brow, his steady hand never wavering as he aimed at the rattlesnake threatening his horse. The creature lay dead now, its menace silenced in the dusty heat of the Arizona Territory, summer of 1879. Yancy holstered his Colt, the metal of his tarnished wedding band catching what little sunlight filtered through the canyon walls. He hadn't removed that ring in 5 years, not since Martha had placed it there before the consumption took her. "Steady, Samson," Yancy murmured to his dapple-gray stallion who snorted and pawed at the ground. "That varmint won't be bothering us no more." He adjusted his hat and mounted, continuing his journey toward Promise Creek, a settlement he'd been avoiding for nearly half a decade. Promise Creek had grown since he'd last seen it. The main street now boasted a proper general store, a saloon that looked less likely to collapse in a strong wind, and a small schoolhouse at the far end. Yancy's eyes lingered on the latter, remembering Martha's dream of teaching there someday. Dreams buried alongside her beneath the cottonwood tree on the outskirts of town, Yancy guided Samson toward the hitching post outside the saloon. His throat felt as dry as the desert he'd just crossed, and a whiskey seemed the only proper medicine. As he dismounted, the jingle of his spurs announced his arrival to those nearby. "Yancy Carter, as I live and breathe," came a familiar voice. Sheriff Tom Billings stood on the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Didn't think we'd see you back in these parts." Yancy nodded curtly. "Tom. Just passing through. For 5 years you've been just passing through everywhere but here. What brings you back?" Yancy's gaze drifted down the street to where the old Carter property stood. "Time, I suppose." His hand unconsciously twisted the tarnished gold band on his finger. The saloon doors swung open and a woman stepped out into the harsh sunlight. She wore a practical dress of deep blue, her auburn hair swept up beneath a modest hat. Ruby Gaines, the town's seamstress, had arrived in Promise Creek 4 years prior after Yancy had begun his wandering. She'd heard stories of the grieving cowboy who couldn't bear to stay in the town where his young wife had died, but had never laid eyes on him until now. "Miss Gaines," Sheriff Billings called, "come meet our returning prodigal. Yancy Carter, this is Ruby Gaines. She took over old Mrs. Henderson's seamstress shop after she passed." Ruby approached with a gentle smile. "Mr. Carter, I've heard much about you." "None of it good, I'd wager," Yancy replied, removing his hat. Despite his gruff words, he found himself struck by the warmth in her green eyes. "On the contrary," Ruby said, "folks speak highly of your skill with horses and your fair dealings, though they do mention your tendency to avoid civilized company." A ghost of a smile played on Yancy's lips. "Been more comfortable with horses than people these past years." Sheriff Billings excused himself to attend to his duties, leaving Yancy and Ruby standing in the midday sun. "I understand you own the old Miller place on the creek," Ruby said, breaking the silence. "It's a shame to see it standing empty all these years." Yancy's jaw tightened. "Not much reason to keep it up. There's always reason to maintain what's yours, Mr. Carter, even if just to honor what was." Her eyes flicked briefly to the tarnished band on his finger. Before Yancy could respond, a commotion erupted from the general store. A man stumbled out, clutching his side where blood seeped through his fingers. "Doc, someone get Doc Palmer," a voice cried out. Instinct took over and Yancy rushed forward, catching the wounded man before he collapsed. "What happened?" "Knife, argument over cards," the man gasped. Ruby appeared at Yancy's side. "The doctor's out at the Thompson farm delivering a baby, won't be back till evening." "Help me get him to the doctor's office," Yancy instructed. "I've patched up enough wounds on the trail to keep him stable till Palmer returns." Together they half-carried the injured man down the street to the small doctor's office. Inside, Yancy quickly located bandages and antiseptic while Ruby prepared hot water. "You've done this before," she observed as Yancy's skilled hands cleaned and dressed the wound. "Too many times," he replied grimly. "Spent some time as a scout for the cavalry, learned medicine out of necessity." For an hour they worked side by side, Yancy stopping the bleeding while Ruby administered laudanum for the pain. When the patient finally fell into an uneasy sleep, they stepped outside, both exhausted and blood-spattered. "You've got steady hands, Mr. Carter," Ruby said, washing hers in the basin outside the office. "Yancy," he corrected her. After bleeding all over you, seems we ought to be on a first-name basis. Ruby, then. She smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, Yancy felt something stir within him that he thought had died with Martha. I should see to my horse, he said abruptly, turning away from feelings he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Will you be staying in town? Ruby asked. Yancy paused. He had planned to move on by morning, continuing the restless wandering that had consumed him since Martha's death. But something, perhaps curiosity, about this woman with her direct gaze and capable hands made him reconsider. Might check on my property, he admitted. See what 5 years of neglect has done to it. It needs work, Ruby said frankly, but the bones are good. Like most things left untended too long. Their eyes met, and Yancy understood she wasn't just talking about his land. The next morning found Yancy standing on the porch of his abandoned homestead. The small 2-room cabin stood weathered but intact, the porch listing slightly to one side. The barn behind needed more attention, its roof partially collapsed from winter snows. The fields that Martha had once dreamed would grow corn and wheat had returned to prairie grass and wildflowers. Yancy pushed open the front door, wincing at the creak of neglected hinges. Inside, dust covered everything: the small table Martha had been so proud of, the rocking chair where she'd sat mending his shirts, the bed where she'd spent her final weeks as consumption ravaged her young body. His throat tightened at the memories. A sound outside drew his attention. Ruby Gaines approached on a chestnut mare, a basket hanging from her arm. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, she called as she dismounted. Thought you might appreciate some provisions. Town's curious why you've returned, making me the subject of gossip, Yancy asked, though without rancor. People wonder about what they don't understand, Ruby replied, climbing the porch steps. A man who abandons a good piece of land to wander aimlessly for 5 years raises questions. Not aimlessly, Yancy corrected, just away. Ruby handed him the basket, which contained bread, cheese, dried meat, and a jar of preserves. Doc Palmer says Mr. Hollister will recover, thanks to your quick action yesterday. Good to hear. Yancy gestured to the dusty interior. It's not much for receiving visitors. I've seen worse, Ruby said, stepping inside without waiting for a proper invitation. She surveyed the room with a practical eye. Needs a woman's touch, but it's salvageable. Not looking for a woman's touch, Yancy said gruffly, following her inside. Ruby's gaze fell on a small framed photograph on the mantel. Martha on their wedding day, her smile radiant, unaware of the short time she had left. She was beautiful. Yes, Yancy's voice was barely audible. She was. How long were you married? Ruby asked gently. 11 months, 2 weeks, 3 days. The precision of his answer revealed the depth of his counting. His remembering, Ruby nodded, turning away from the photograph. I lost my fiancée to a mining accident in Colorado. That's why I came east to Promise Creek. Too many memories in Silverton. The simple admission of shared grief created a bridge between them. Yancy felt the weight of his isolation lift slightly, recognizing in Ruby someone who understood loss without being consumed by it. I should leave you to your work, Ruby said after a moment. The Ladies' Aid Society meets tomorrow at the church. They've been maintaining the cemetery. Your wife's grave is well tended. The mention of Martha's grave sent a stab of guilt through Yancy. He hadn't visited since the day they'd lowered her into the ground. Thank you, he managed. For letting me know. Ruby hesitated at the door. Will you stay? In Promise Creek, I mean. Yancy looked around at the dusty remains of the life he'd abandoned. Don't know yet. Got 5 years of running to reconsider, Ruby nodded. Well, if you decide to rebuild here, I make sturdy curtains. Every home needs proper curtains. With that practical statement, she left, mounting her mare and riding back toward town. Yancy watched her go, puzzled by the woman who spoke of curtains and grief with equal directness. He glanced down at his wedding band, tarnished from years of work and weather, never removed even when the memories it represented threatened to drown him. For 3 days, Yancy worked from dawn until dusk repairing the cabin and barn. He mended the roof, replaced broken windows, and scrubbed years of dust from the floors and walls. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, though Martha's presence lingered in every corner. On the 4th day, Ruby returned, this time with Daniel Johnson, the town's carpenter. Hope you don't mind, she said as they dismounted. I mentioned you were rebuilding, and Daniel offered his assistance with the barn roof. Daniel grinned, displaying a missing front tooth. Been meaning to check on this place anyway. Good land shouldn't go to waste. Yancy might have bristled at the interference a week earlier, but now he merely nodded. Appreciate the help. Roof's beyond my skills alone. Together the men worked on the barn while Ruby tackled the cabin's interior, hanging the curtains she'd promised and arranging the sparse furniture to best advantage. By late afternoon, when Daniel departed, the homestead looked considerably more habitable. You didn't have to do all this, Yancy told Ruby as they sat on the porch, drinking coffee. I know, she replied simply, but neighbors help neighbors. That's how we survive out here. Is that what we are, neighbors? Yancy asked, studying her profile in the waning light. Ruby met his gaze steadily. For now, unless you're planning to run again. Her directness both challenged and intrigued him. Been thinking about that. Seems running hasn't solved much these past years. Running rarely does, Ruby agreed. Though sometimes it gives us the distance we need to see clearly. And what do you see clearly, Ruby Gaines? Yancy asked. A man at a crossroads, she answered. And a decent homestead that could be something special with enough care. She stood, gathering her things. I should get back before dark. Yancy walked her to her horse. Thank you for the curtains and everything else. Ruby smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. You're welcome, Yancy Carter. As she rode away, Yancy felt more anchored than he had in years, as though her practical presence had somehow tethered him to the land he'd abandoned. The next Sunday, Yancy surprised himself by attending church services. He sat in the back row, uncomfortable in his best shirt and freshly polished boots. He caught Ruby's eye as she sang in the choir, her clear voice rising above the others. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement. After the service, Yancy steeled himself and walked to the small cemetery behind the church. He hadn't been here since the funeral, had avoided even riding past on his way out of town 5 years ago. Martha's grave was, as Ruby had said, well tended. Fresh wildflowers lay at the base of the simple headstone. Martha Elizabeth Carter, beloved wife, 1856–1874. Yancy knelt, removing his hat, his tarnished wedding band gleaming dully in the sunlight. I'm sorry, he whispered, for leaving you alone so long. She wasn't alone, came Ruby's voice behind him. She approached quietly, her Sunday dress rustling against the grass. The ladies take turns bringing flowers. Mrs. Patterson tells her about the town gossip every Wednesday. Despite himself, Yancy smiled. Martha would have liked that. She loved hearing stories. Ruby knelt beside him, placing her own small bouquet beside the others. Tell me about her. No one had asked Yancy about Martha in years. Most folks avoided the subject, afraid to trigger his grief. But Ruby asked directly, giving him permission to remember aloud. She laughed all the time, he began haltingly, even when she got sick, said there was no sense in being gloomy when life gave you so many reasons to smile. He touched the headstone gently. She wanted children, a houseful. That's why we bought such a big piece of land. She sounds remarkable, Ruby said. She was. Yancy stood, helping Ruby to her feet. I couldn't stay here after. Everything reminded me of what wouldn't be. Ruby nodded in understanding. And now, Yancy looked back at the grave. Now I'm thinking maybe she wouldn't want the land to go to waste either. As summer progressed, Yancy continued restoring his property. He repaired fences, cleared fields, and even purchased 2 milk cows and a dozen chickens from the Thompson farm. Each improvement felt like a reclaiming of his life, a step away from grief toward something he couldn't yet name. Ruby visited regularly, sometimes bringing food or supplies, other times simply sitting with him on the porch as the sun set. They talked easily, sharing stories of their lives before Promise Creek. Yancy learned that Ruby had grown up in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a tailor who had taught her the trade. She'd followed her fiancé west when he sought his fortune in the silver mines, only to lose him in a cave in 3 months before their wedding. How did you move forward? Yancy asked one evening as they watched fireflies dance over the newly cleared fields. 1 stitch at a time, Ruby answered, her hands busy with mending work she'd brought along. Each day I'd thread my needle and make 1 more stitch. Some days that's all I could manage, but stitches add up. Yancy nodded, understanding the metaphor. Been putting in my stitches lately, I suppose. Ruby glanced at him, a smile playing at her lips. Yes, you have. This place is coming back to life. The weeks turned to months, and as autumn approached, Yancy realized he'd passed the anniversary of his departure from Promise Creek without the urge to flee again. Instead, he found himself looking forward to Ruby's visits, planning improvements to share with her, wondering about her reaction to his latest project. One September afternoon, Yancy rode into town for supplies and encountered Sheriff Billings outside the general store. "Carter," the sheriff greeted him. "Place is looking good. Planning to stay through winter, I take it?" "Looks that way," Yancy confirmed. "Got something that belongs to you then?" Billings reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Found this in the desk after you left. Figured you'd come back for it eventually." Yancy opened the pouch to find a simple gold locket Martha's, containing a tiny photograph of her parents. He'd given it to her on their wedding day, and she'd worn it until her final illness. "Thank you," Yancy said, emotion thickening his voice. "I thought this was buried with her. She asked Mrs. Patterson to keep it for your children someday," Billings explained. "When you left so sudden-like, Mrs. Patterson gave it to me for safekeeping." Yancy clutched the locket. Another piece of Martha returned to him when he was finally ready to receive it. After finishing his purchases, he stopped by Ruby's shop, finding her bent over an elaborate wedding dress. "Mayor's daughter?" he asked, recognizing the quality of the fabric. Ruby looked up, her face lighting at the sight of him. "Yes, getting married at Christmas. Young love waits for no season," she set aside her work. "What brings you to town midweek?" Yancy showed her the locket, explaining its history. "Seems parts of Martha are finding their way back to me now that I've stopped running." Ruby touched the locket gently. "It's beautiful. She had good taste." "I'd like you to have it," Yancy said impulsively. Ruby's eyes widened. "Yancy, I couldn't possibly, not to keep," he clarified. "To wear, to the harvest dance next month, as my—" He faltered, unfamiliar with courtship after so many years. "As your what, Yancy Carter?" Ruby asked softly, her eyes never leaving his face. "As my companion for the evening," he finished, "if you do me the honor." A slow smile spread across Ruby's face. "I would be pleased to accompany you, Mr. Carter." The Promise Creek Harvest Dance transformed the plain town hall into a celebration of autumn bounty. Garlands of dried corn husks hung from the rafters, pumpkins and gourds decorated tables laden with food, and lanterns cast a warm glow over the proceedings. The town's small band, consisting of a fiddle, banjo, and piano, played lively tunes that had couples spinning across the wooden floor. Yancy stood nervously outside Ruby's small house behind her shop, his best suit brushed free of dust, his boots polished to a shine. He'd even trimmed his beard and had the barber cut his hair. In his hand, he held a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered from the meadow near his home. When Ruby opened the door, Yancy momentarily forgot to breathe. She wore a dress of deep copper that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd arranged in an elegant twist. Martha's locket hung at her throat, catching the light as she moved. "You look beautiful," Yancy said, handing her the flowers. "Thank you," Ruby replied, a blush coloring her cheeks. "You clean up rather well yourself, Cowboy." At the dance, they joined other couples on the floor, Yancy surprising Ruby with his skill. "Martha taught me," he explained as they twirled. "Said no husband of hers would stand along the wall while others danced." "She was a wise woman," Ruby laughed, her hand warm in his. Later, as they stepped outside for air, Yancy noticed Ruby shiver in the cool evening breeze. He removed his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," he said as they walked along the quiet street. "It's been a long time since I enjoyed myself this much." Ruby looked up at him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Yancy, may I ask you something personal?" He nodded, curious. "Your wedding band," she said, gesturing to his left hand where the tarnished gold still circled his finger. "You've never taken it off, have you?" Yancy twisted the ring unconsciously. "No, felt like the only piece of her I had left." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "It's a beautiful gesture of devotion, but I wonder if Martha would want it to become a chain rather than a memory." Her words struck him deeply. Was the ring keeping Martha's memory alive, or was it binding him to grief that prevented him from living fully? "I don't know how to let go," he admitted, the most honest he'd been with anyone, including himself, in years. Ruby took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Perhaps it's not about letting go, but about making room. Martha will always be part of your story, Yancy. Nothing can change that." They stood in silence for a moment, the distant music from the dance floating on the night air. Then, slowly, Yancy bent down and kissed her. It was gentle, questioning, a first step rather than a declaration. When they parted, Ruby's eyes remained closed for a moment, a small smile playing at her lips. "I've been wanting to do that for some time," Yancy confessed. "I've been hoping you would," Ruby replied, her hand still in his. Winter settled over Promise Creek with a series of heavy snowfalls that blanketed the landscape in white. Yancy worked through the cold months, adding a second room to his cabin and building furniture for the spring. Ruby visited when weather permitted, bringing holiday treats and news from town. Their courtship progressed slowly, respectful of their shared experiences with loss and mindful of the community's watching with interest. On Christmas Eve, Yancy invited Ruby to dinner at his homestead. He'd spent days preparing, cooking a small turkey, baking bread from his mother's recipe, and even attempting a pie that turned out lopsided but edible. "This is wonderful," Ruby said as they sat before the fire after their meal. "You've made this place a home again." Yancy looked around the cabin, seeing it through her eyes the curtains she'd made, the rocking chair he'd built, the photograph of Martha now joined by one of Ruby he'd taken in town. "It's getting there," he agreed. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her fingers. "Ruby, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about making room." From his pocket he withdrew a small box. "This isn't what you might think," he said quickly, noting her widened eyes. "It's too soon for that, but I wanted you to have this." Inside the box lay a simple silver bracelet adorned with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Yancy explained, "the only thing I have left of her." Ruby touched it reverently. "Yancy, it's beautiful, but such a family heirloom belongs with someone I care deeply for," he finished for her. "Someone who helped me find my way home." As he fastened the bracelet around her wrist, Ruby noticed something different about him. "Your ring," she said softly. Yancy held up his bare left hand. "Took it off this morning, first time in 5 years." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced the tarnished gold band. "It needed cleaning, and I needed to choose to wear it, not just keep wearing it because I couldn't bear to take it off." Ruby understood the significance of the gesture. "What will you do with it?" "Not sure yet," Yancy admitted. "But it felt right to make room, as you said." Spring brought new life to Promise Creek and to Yancy's farm. He planted the fields Martha had once dreamed of, raised a new barn with the help of neighboring farmers, and expanded his livestock to include a small herd of cattle. Ruby's business thrived as well, with orders coming from as far as Tucson for her fine needlework. Their courtship continued through the changing seasons, their bond deepening with each shared sunset, each challenge weathered together. They spoke openly of their pasts, honoring the loves they had lost while nurturing the love growing between them. One evening in late May, as wildflowers carpeted the meadows around Yancy's property, he asked Ruby to walk with him to a special place he wanted to show her. He led her to a small rise overlooking the creek, where he had planted 2 young cottonwood trees. "This was Martha's favorite spot," he explained. "She used to say the view reminded her of heaven." Ruby squeezed his hand. "It's beautiful. I wanted to bring you here because—" Yancy took a deep breath. "Because Martha is part of who I am, and you know all of me now. The good and the broken parts." He turned to face her fully. "I love you, Ruby Gaines, not instead of Martha, but because my heart learned from loving her how to love again. If you'll have me, I want to build a life with you here." Tears shimmered in Ruby's eyes as she looked up at him. "I've loved you since you mended that man's wound in the doctor's office, so capable and kind even through your grief." Yancy knelt before her, withdrawing a small box from his pocket. Inside lay a new gold ring, simple and elegant. "Will you marry me, Ruby? Help me fill this land with the family Martha and I dreamed of." "Yes," Ruby answered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. They were married in the Promise Creek Church on a perfect June morning with the entire town in attendance. Sheriff Billings stood as Yancy's best man, and Mrs. Patterson, who had tended Martha's grave so faithfully, sat in the front row crying happy tears for the cowboy who had finally found his way home. After the ceremony, as guests gathered at the Carter homestead for the celebration, Yancy led Ruby to their bedroom. On the dresser sat a small wooden box he had crafted, its lid inlaid with a design of intertwining wildflowers. "A wedding present," he said, opening it to reveal the interior lined with velvet. In the center lay his old wedding band, now cleaned and polished to a soft glow. "I wanted you to know," Yancy said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I'm not hiding it away or pretending the past didn't happen. But I'm putting it where it belongs as a cherished memory, not a daily burden." Ruby kissed him tenderly. "It's perfect, Yancy, a perfect place for perfect memories." As she closed the lid and slipped the box into the drawer, Ruby knew that this act, the cleaning of a tarnished ring and its gentle retirement, represented not an ending but a continuation. The love Yancy had shared with Martha had taught him how to love her, and together they would honor the past while building their future. Outside, their guests called for the couple. Yancy took Ruby's hand, his new wedding band catching the light. "Shall we, Mrs. Carter?" Ruby smiled up at her husband, her heart full. "Lead the way, Cowboy, our story is just beginning." And as they stepped into the sunlight, greeted by cheers and well wishes, the small drawer remained closed, containing a treasured chapter of a life well loved, neither forgotten nor constraining, but preserved with honor and respect, making room for the new story being written with every passing day.